Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Challenges afoot for a government that just can't seem to handle the mounting crises it faces. Whether it's the possibility of a Russian invasion in Ukraine, soaring murders of police officers on the streets of America, or even political shenanigans that seem obvious to regular folk, but bewildering to those in the DC swamp. And at the bottom of the pile, we have Americans suffering for the sins of those who claim to be leading them. Welcome to the political gauntlet. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's packed episode, we'll examine whether President Biden's inept handling of Putin is bringing America one step closer to war, if the swamp in its present form can handle DC machinations, and what's likely to happen with Biden's as yet unknown Supreme Court nominee. I'd like to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to our listeners in Chester Springs, Philadelphia on WFYL 1180 AM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Joe Biden facing crisis after crisis. Polls showing that he is sinking faster than the Titanic. How low can he go? Well, to help us answer these questions is Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Lisa K. Donner. Welcome back, Lisa. Thanks for being here.
Glad to do it, Mark. What's up?
What I got to know is, how is Joe Biden getting on? I mean, this is a concern not only for us political hounds who follow every bit of news that's taking place, but for people just all over the world wondering, is Joe Biden failing or succeeding at being president of the United States?
Well, I think he has a number of, health issues, not the least of which is his cognitive decline, which we've seen, before, during, and, I won't say after, but before and during his presidency, popping off at Peter Doocy. I mean, I just heard somebody say, well, Trump popped off at a lot of people. What's the big deal? This was odd. It was unprovoked. It was seemingly out of the blue. And as someone who's older than you, I can tell you that dementia is not a normal part of aging, and something is going wrong with Joe Biden, and it's got to be some form of dementia.
Yeah, it struck me as odd when he lashed out at Peter Doocy. But you wrote up a piece on LibertyNation.com pretty much straight away on that, where you talked about how this ties in with the aneurysms that he's had in the past and how it's classical symptoms of a certain type of dementia. And I noticed that, I believe it was Dr. Mark Siegel on Fox News, literally the morning after, it came out with pretty much word for word the things that you're doing. So it's not just people who are in the media business are talking about this. This is medical professionals also saying the same thing.
Yeah, this is not random speculation, And meanwhile, an ABC Ipsos poll was out, and he's just tanking in the polls. And so now you have a president who may, in fact, or probably likely does have some form of dementia. And you've got the economy tanking. Now we're sending troops over to Ukraine and Russia. I mean, how is he doing? There are no words.
Well, let's jump into that ABC News Ipsos poll, because that was rather startling as far as I'm concerned. I mean, on the economy, you had, I believe it was 75% describing the economy as not so good. That's 75% of people. And as former Bill Clinton strategist, I believe James Carville pointed out, it's the economy stupid. How does that look for the Democrats going into the congressional elections this year in November?
Well, I think there's a great deal of fear that there's going to be a blue bloodbath, and that's probably why a lot of advocacy media outlets are starting to run for the hills. They're starting to take on the administration. They're getting a little nastier with Psaki in the press conferences, because Biden on COVID, he's lost 1 in 5 Americans. And this was his high water mark. He went from 69% to 50%. That was his highest in the ABC Ipsos poll. Economy, 75% in the tank. Immigration, 34% of those approve of what he's doing at the border. 64% disapprove of what he's doing with crime in the United States. And that's a nightmare. We've got, every week it's a new major cop funeral. New York's had 2 in 2 weeks, and it's where is the good news? I mean, I understand he's overperformed, but
allegedly, at least according to Joe Biden and his press secretary. Now, you mentioned these police funerals that we've all seen on the television, where it's a sea of blue, a sea of brothers and sisters wearing the blue, filling the streets. At the same time, you have Jen Psaki going on national television in an interview, and she's watching the Fox News TV screens on her panel, and she says they're talking about soft on crime. She says, what does that even mean? Well, Lisa, I think you can tell us what it means, even if Jen Psaki can't.
I think John Q. Public can tell you that soft on crime means letting somebody out on $1,000 bail who should be in jail, and they go out and they murder somebody or whatever, not holding criminals to account, not just with lack of bail, but constantly letting them out. And it's almost like a permission concept. Smash and grabs, we're being told, well, just let them take what they want and go. How about carjackings up like 500 some percent, right? Between 400 and 500% they're up. And we're being told, well, just hand your keys over to whoever wants to take your car. I mean, this is a problem. This is why cops and citizens are all being gunned down.
Yeah, so the people are taking up to $900, over $900 worth of stuff, and they're walking out the door. And it's not like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez says, where these people are stealing bread because they need to eat. They don't sell bread at these stores. They don't sell bread at Gucci. They just don't do that. And so what's happened is, as you point out, they've been given permission to commit crimes, and if they're not being prosecuted, as they're not in New York now with the new DA, they're just going to continue to do it. Now, another crime.
Let me just interrupt you for 1 second. I mean, they're not doing it in New York. They're not doing it in Philadelphia. They're not doing it in San Francisco. They're not doing it in LA. I mean, this is a national problem, and we know why there is a national problem, because George Soros put tons of money into electing liberal DAs, and that's what we've got.
Now, let's talk about another crime, or at least it's a crime as far as most of John Q. Public, as you point out, see it. And that's airplanes in the middle of the night, dropping off illegal migrants who have crossed the borders, and we're not being told about it. What's your take on that?
Well, this is an interesting dynamic, because apparently, and I talked to Scott Cosenza, our legal affairs editor, there's not necessarily a law on the books that says you can't fly illegal aliens around the country. But of course, what the problem is they're letting them in the country to begin with. So apparently some kind of law has to be enacted. But, I think there's just kind of a moral and ethical issue with flying people to communities in the dead of night and not telling the people in that community, and, letting them know that there are new people arriving to live with them, and who are they and how many and when and where. It feels really dirty, underhanded, like a clandestine operation.
Well, it's not just the people in the communities, is it? It's the governors, it's law enforcement, it's the locally elected leaders. They don't know either. This is all being done by the federal government against the state governments. And I think that, the states, people pay the taxes. They pay it for schools, they pay it for hospitals, facilities, things like this. And all that taxpayer money, if you have an extra 5,000 people in a small community, you'll need more hospitals, you need more school places. So what's happening to the services that they're paying for already through their tax dollars?
It's like they're getting on the plane and, would you like a cocktail courtesy of the taxpayer of, the United States? I mean, look, everything is being paid for. These people are going to go to our schools. They're, but the original sin really is letting them in. And we've been letting a lot of folks in. And that's the problem. I think, sending them to these communities is just not great. It's not the best way to handle a situation. But, they're trying to scoot them off the border so that there isn't 17,000 of them stuck underneath the Del Rio Bridge.
Yeah, I remember the days when crossing a border illegally used to actually be illegal. Lisa K. Donner, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome, Mark.
Later in the show, we'll be figuring out what path Biden's SCOTUS nomination will take and whether it's a shoo-in that everybody thinks it is. But up next, we're asking whether Joe Biden is blindly leading America into a major confrontation with Vladimir Putin. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Is President Joe Biden pushing America into a war with Russia to distract from issues on the home front? Well, that's a question that sadly, many people are now considering a possibility. Will Putin oblige? And what's the latest situation? Well, to help us figure this out, we're joined by our expert in all things military defense, former Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Dave Patterson. Welcome back to the show, Dave. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Now, Dave, I think what we're seeing here is a back and forth escalation of letters and demands and briefings with neither side really willing to make any concessions. And Vladimir Putin, he recently released his thoughts on this. What did he say of it and what did he make of it?
Well, I think that most commentators that listen to Putin's press conference after his nearly 5-hour meeting with Hungary's Prime Minister Orban would probably say it was more of a rehash of his standard set of grievances. It was sort of like a Festivus celebration with the airing of grievances. But Putin is upset by a number of issues, and he calls the West out principally for, as he said, indelicately, screwing over Russia. And he primarily accuses the West of ignoring Russia's security demands. He talked about George W. Bush's administration quitting the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and he maintains that caused Russia to develop new missiles of their own. And of course, he talked about his standards saw the expansion of NATO, and he's quite keen that NATO does not expand. But, he offered no solutions to the stalemate between U.S., NATO, and Russia. And, there are certain things that he also leaves out. He leaves out, for example, any mention of Stalin's systematic starving of millions of Ukrainians in 1932 and 33. He doesn't mention the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that established Ukraine's independence in exchange for Kiev giving up nuclear warheads that were stored there. Russia, incidentally, signed that memorandum. But I think in total, if you look at the upside of his views, he did suggest that a Russian invasion of the Ukraine might not be imminent, as the Biden administration suggests.
I mean, there really is a concerted effort from all nations around the world here to join forces against the perceived Russian aggression. But they are also forceful, as you point out here, that the idea that Ukraine should become a NATO member. And as far as I can tell, that really is the root cause of all this. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's not clear to me that everyone is on the same page with either Ukraine or Georgia becoming NATO members. I think that there are people, Germans principally, who might not think that was a good idea. And all 30 members of NATO must be in agreement to bring on new members. So it's not clear to me that there's this unanimity of enthusiasm for Ukraine becoming a member of NATO.
Now, what's the European Union situation? Are they pushing for Ukrainian membership to NATO?
I would say that generally Europe is ambivalent about NATO membership. What they are not ambivalent about is the fact that Ukraine should be able to carry on trade, and within the European Union, they think that the Ukraine ought to have the ability to move toward a more Eurocentric position for the country.
You wrote a fascinating article on libertynation.com recently that discussed whether Joe Biden was in danger of pushing America into a war. Can you give us a brief rundown of your reasoning here, please?
I think that what's happening here is that the Biden administration is very much using a lot of very bellicose threats. And the fact that they've put on alert so many of the U.S. forces, they talk about blunting the Russian expansion into eastern Ukraine. They very seldom talk about specific initiatives to solve the stalemate. In fact, in that regard, they're pretty much like Putin. But I think that most recently, when Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, invoked the number 5 case for NATO, and that, of course, is a paragraph that says if one member of NATO is attacked, then all will come to its aid. The only issue there is that Ukraine, as we know, is not a member of NATO.
I mean, I look at our political leaders, all around the world, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Justin Trudeau, and others, and they're all beset by major difficulties on the domestic front. Now, is it possible that they're letting these domestic threats to their positions and agendas impact their decision-making with regards to the Russia-Ukraine situation? As in, they need some kind of win, and there's no way they can get it at home, so they're looking abroad to try and bring some credibility or power status back to themselves.
I think that's right. I think that's what you normally would do is, take the limelight off of the problems that you have and put it somewhere else. And in this case, President Putin has offered them an excellent target.
One more question for you, Dave. You've noted earlier that Putin has an ally in Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. And of course, Putin, he's attending the Winter Olympics over in China at the moment. What does this message send to the West?
Well, I think it sends the message that Russia and China are growing more close together. I think that more importantly, you have combined exercises between Russian and Chinese Navy and ground forces, more exercises than we've seen historically. I think that all of these things combine to certainly reinforce the impression that they are very close allies. And of course, that creates a problem for the West, and particularly the United States. And I think that it's significant that President Putin would go there for the Winter Olympics.
I'm sure that's all just worry because obviously the Defense Department lets us know that climate change is, of course, the bigger threat. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. You've got it right on climate change.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Further down the line, we discuss affirmative action for the next Supreme Court justice. But after this short break, we return to find out whether the GOP has a fifth column. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Is there a fifth column in the Republican Party? And if so, who do they have their sights set on? That's the question that's doing the rounds in the DC swamp. We're in a year of congressional midterms, and everything, yes, everything, is about how to gain a majority. To what lengths will the so-called conservatives go to maintain some grip on power? Well, to help us navigate the brackish waters of Washington, D.C., is longtime host of this here Liberty Nation Radio and Liberty Nation senior political correspondent, Tim Donner. Thanks for taking the time, Tim.
Always good to be back, Mark.
So, Tim, you wrote recently about a merry band of never-Trumpers in the GOP, and more importantly, what lengths they might go to keep the 45th president from becoming the 47th. What's your overall analysis?
Well, my first part of the analysis is that, Mark, I certainly didn't describe them as a merry band because they're anything but merry. They're deranged, but they're deranged in varying degrees. And what I mean is I've sort of narrowed down the Never Trump movement, Mark, to 3 stages. The first stage was to oppose Trump in the primary of 2016, which was totally legitimate. There were 15 other strong candidates. Even if you're sounding the alarm bell, okay, that's what a primary is for. The second stage is to go ahead and oppose Trump in his presidential campaign against Hillary Clinton. And then the third stage is to actually oppose the president's reelection after he's delivered essentially everything that he promised, which is pretty much in keeping with everything everybody in the Never Trump movement said they believed and worked for years on end for their entire careers. And then we're willing to throw it all away because of this one individual. And so they provided aid and comfort to the enemy, essentially their political enemy, and they became useful idiots, the very thing that they basically accused the left of being for communists in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's funny that even people who opposed Trump before he became president gave him an A grade in terms of policy. And this was people who were seriously against the Trump presidency. And yet, in terms of what he actually achieved, you know, they really couldn't fault him on those, especially getting things delivered. Now, an important point you make is that these folks, that they're saying that the Republican Party left them behind. Now, on two levels, I find this both disingenuous and odd. First of all, parties change all the time. That doesn't mean you get to hold back where your party's heading. It could just be you that's changed in this situation. And second, I'm not even sure that's historically true. What do you say?
Well, you know, Ronald Reagan was the first presidential candidate that used that expression, that he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. And so everybody's tried to use it since. But the big difference, Mark, is that when Reagan left the Democratic Party, he had a Republican Party to go to. He left one place for another. But these never Trumpers, they can't actually go, and they won't, and actually join the Democratic Party. All they'll do is work against Trump, so they get the worst of both worlds. They won't be a part officially of the opposition party, but they will have been kicked out of the party in power. And if they think that, you know, the left's going to be interested in them beyond their usefulness in making sure Trump doesn't return to power, I think they're in for a rude awakening.
Yeah, let's talk about the actual maths here for a moment, Tim, and whether these fifth columnists, as you described in your article, will be successful. Now, obviously, it's the congressional elections coming up soon, or the midterms, as we like to call them. They're still a few months out, but based on your analysis so far, what do you see happening?
Well, usually a good gauge of what's going to happen is how many members of Congress retire from the party that's expected to lose. Right now, the count is up above 25 for Democrats, which is not extraordinary.
It's 30 is the latest count.
Is it okay? So it's up to 30 now. That's not extraordinary when you consider that 42 Republicans either resigned or ran for a higher office in 2018. But of course, look at the result. The Republicans lost 42 seats. So these members of Congress can see it in the cards. They just don't want to be a member of a minority party, because in the balkanized political climate we're in now, who wants to be part of the congressional minority, which has zero power and which will be, let's be honest, given zero respect by the majority party? So, look, I think it's going to be a landslide slaughter. In the House, I project 60 to 80 seats, similar to 2010 in Obama's midterm and his first term. In the Senate, I think the Democrats have a chance only by virtue of mathematics, because the Republicans have to defend 20 of the 34 seats. So mathematically, Democrats have a chance. But on the ground, Biden's approval is so staggeringly low for a first-term president that he's a He's a millstone around their neck that they can't get rid of. And they can't call for Kamala Harris because she's even less popular. So it's it could be, the Senate could be a disaster too for the Democrats. I think it's going to be, let's put it this way, if I'm a Democrat, I would avert my eyes on election night.
Yeah, it's quite notable, I think, that in two of President Biden's recent visits to states, I think it was Georgia and Pennsylvania, that the key players in those states, Stacey Abrams, for example, or different candidates for office in those states, refused to turn up, claiming scheduling conflicts. In an election year, they've decided we do not need to be seen, we do not need to be photographed, and we do not need to be associated
precisely
with the president who leads our party. And that is shocking in itself. I think that tells us all we pretty much need to know about how the congressional elections are going to go. Now, I guess the next question, our final question, has to be, based on your analysis here, what can we expect Joe Biden to get done after November?
Well, you might remember what Barack Obama said after the 2014 midterm elections, he called 2010 a shellacking. 2014 wasn't quite as bad, but it was pretty bad. But what he said afterwards, I've got my pen and my phone. And that's all Biden's going to have. The problem is he's not nearly the dynamic character that Barack Obama was. He's in decline. It's an irreversible decline because this is not like cancer or any number of diseases that can be overcome. Dementia, his cognitive decline is not anything that can possibly reverse itself because of the nature of the condition. So, he's going to be about as powerless as a president can be, given the combination of probably losing both houses of Congress and, for all intents and purposes, having lost his party, which will try to distance itself from him and focus on anybody they can get to run in 2024 that can beat Donald Trump or whoever the Republicans put up.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure.
After this short break, we'll be back talking liberty and finding out why Kamala Harris may not have the swing vote on the Supreme Court nomination. Coming up next. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Justice Breyer is stepping down from the Supreme Court, and President Biden is set to replace him with a black female come hell or high water. But is it going to be an easy win for the president? And perhaps more importantly, will it get him the respect that he thinks he deserves? We're talking liberty with constitutional attorney, legal affairs editor, and host of the always excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, to help us figure out the maths on this. Welcome back, Scott.
Cheers, Mark, and thank you. Always a pleasure.
So, Scott, you wrote recently that Joe Biden traded his support for a black female nominee for presidential primary support from House Majority Whip James Clyburn. Now, it seems that Joe Biden made good on his pledge to Clyburn, but are the American people happy about it?
Well, no, they're not. Only, I think, 27% at a maximum level of Americans polled support this kind of decision-making, affirmative action decision-making for the Supreme Court, and those were people of color. So even in the communities where you think it would be the most popular type of decision-making, just because of what they're sold on a daily basis from the legacy media, they're not for it. And when polled American-wide, I think it was only 23% of Americans support it. So the rest of the people stand in opposition to this kind of decision-making. And it's important to remember when Joe Biden wraps himself in that cape of, racial heroism and civil rights heroism, that this was just a pay-for-play deal that he used to secure his own nomination. It had nothing to do with any good intention, just Joe Biden's desire to have power.
Yeah, it was James Clyburn of South Carolina. It was his support that really set off the numbers for Joe Biden's primary run, I believe, was it?
Joe Biden had never won a presidential primary in hhis 3 attempts at becoming president of the United States until 3 days after that endorsement came in. And the week before the endorsement, he was polling at like 23 percentile, I think, in some polls in the state. And he won with a plurality of like 47 some percent. At the time, it's, now obviously he's the president and he'll be the nominee if he wants it, presumably. But back then it was a real iffy proposition as to whether or not Joe Biden would win the nomination. And Clyburn's endorsement basically sealed the deal for him.
Kingmaker Clyburn, indeed. So who are the front runners for this Supreme Court nomination? And to date, do we know how, let's say, acceptable they'll be to the Senate as a whole?
Mark, for me, I think Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, is my guess for who he's going to pick. There are a number of other names that have been bandied about, right down to, and I do say down to, meaning it would be the bottom of the barrel choice, which is that of Kamala Harris. And I think it's just preposterous to think that she'll be nominated, but a lot of Democrat Party activists are pushing that name. I don't think there's a chance in hell that that's going to fly, though, because of the second part of your question, in part, which is that she won't be well received in the Senate. It's, of course, the body that she served in, by Democrat senators, by the way. I'm not even just referring to Republicans. And some of the other names, too, that we see tossed around will also likely not face a welcome reception in the Senate, which is one of the reasons why Judge Jackson, I think, will be the nominee. She's already been vetted for what is, kind of commonly referred to as the second highest court in the land, which is that D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So she passed muster for that vote, and she hasn't done anything while on that court to suggest that she's unfit for the highest levels of judicial service.
Okay, I think it's important to make that this nominee, if it's Ms. Ketanji Brown Jackson or anybody else, will need to be acceptable both to Democrats and Republicans, because just last week we saw Democrat Senator Lujan out of New Mexico. He had a stroke, essentially counting him out of the Senate for a little while. Now, with a 50-50 split, obviously Kamala Harris being the one that picks it over the top, there are a number of factors that could go wrong if Biden relies only on Democrat votes. Isn't that right?
I think the more important point to address is what you just said about Kamala Harris putting a vote over the top. None other than Lawrence Tribe, who is a legal scholar, who's a former professor of law at Harvard and has been used by the Biden administration as kind of their kind of
go-to constitutional scholar.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, with like the big gravitas, he has all this sort of weight in the legal community. And he said before the Biden administration took office that a vice president could not vote to break a tie in a Supreme Court nomination. And the reason why is that while the vice president can vote for regular legislation to break a tie, in the advice and consent role, which is what the Senate is performing in that nomination of the justice, the confirmation of the justice, they have no role. The vice president does not. And so he was recently asked again whether he still holds this, whether he's a hypocrite, basically, I think is sort of the question. And he's not in this area in any case. And he said that it would be unconstitutional for Kamala Harris to cast a vote in this role. So your point is even, more important, or the question is even more important. I don't think you're going to see any Democrat defections from that nominee, for instance. If you go to some of the more radical names that have been tossed around, some of the law professors, it's also a little bit of wishful thinking, like somebody who has a friend who's a law professor who, works in the White House, they might leak a name. It's difficult to determine who really is at the top of that list. But because of her position as a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who was already recently vetted. That's the other thing you have to remember about the confirmation process. If you want a speedy confirmation, the best possible thing to do is nominate somebody who has had a recent nomination to the federal courts, because all of their background, their writings and all have already been submitted to these bodies, and they have them for reference and have already vetted them.
So we can assume that because of her prior vetting, which is so recent that unless she's done something insane within the last couple of weeks, it still holds good. But politically, do we think that Republicans are likely to back the nominee, or will they vote against her on principle?
Well, historically, Republicans they give much greater support to the nominees of Democrat executives than the reverse. Democrat legislators often withhold their support from Republican choices, seemingly for political reasons. The idea that, for instance, not a single Democrat senator thought that Amy Coney Barrett was a suitable person to be a justice on the Supreme Court, I think is a bit ridiculous. I think that they did it just for political means. And if you look at the votes historically of who votes for whose picks more, Republicans have a much more likelihood of crossing the aisle. And the idea that some of the more liberal senators, like a Susan Collins, for instance, would vote no on Judge Brown, I don't see that happening. So I think it'll be an easy ride for somebody like that if she's nominated.
Now, Ilya Shapiro, who's a Georgetown professor, he's been put on leave for making tweets about Joe Biden's decision to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. What's the story here?
Well, are you a professor if you're suspended before your first day at work? It's an interesting question. I think they're still paying him, so I suppose he is. He tweeted about the negative aspect of picking a justice and having their first qualification be the color of their skin, and the second qualification being their private parts. That's the idea that he bucked against. And he said that the justice would always have an asterisk next to her name, and basically that they were a lesser candidate. And he phrased it kind of a little inartfully, but that was the crux of his argument. And boy, the left really came for him. And it's one of these deals where if you could take a statement one of two ways, and one way is a academic objection to affirmative action and race and sex-based choices, and the other way is that somebody is just a racist. There's kind of a willful misunderstanding, if you will, and that's the position of the Georgetown Law School, like Black Lives Matter Club. I forget what they actually call it, but that's essentially what it is. And they've made hay over it. And he is a libertarian, and that's one of the reasons why they're gunning for him, because anybody who's not sort of the pro-progressive or leftist views gets, naturally attacked when the opportunity arises, and the opportunity has arisen. Of course, the correct response for anybody who values academic integrity and free speech in any remote way would be to just tell those Twitter mob brush off and go pound sand. But that's not the case at Georgetown Law, where they have embraced the consequences of annoying people on Twitter.
Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that almost does us for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank you, our faithful listeners, for being here, and our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Dave Patterson, Tim Donner, and Scott DeCosenza, for taking the time to join us. And my parting shot for this week concerns language. When President Biden speaks, his words are clarified by the White House press secretary, who passes on his actual meaning to the Fourth Estate, who then, in turn, spin and massage his words into something these so-called journalists feel is palatable to the masses and in the finer interests of the government they so ardently support. I'm reminded of the words of President William Taft, who once said, "Don't write so that you can be understood. Write so that you can't be misunderstood." Now, communication is easy. Speak honestly. Speak true without trying to make yourself appear an elite in your knowledge, and the world will understand your meaning perfectly. It's when we attempt to lie or obfuscate or cover up that the necessity of convoluted speech comes forward. Is it too much to ask that those who claim to lead us treat us with at least some honesty and respect? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for
I think
LibertyNation.com.
we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.